Interesting to see some of the contrasts there. For more, let's bring in Finn Gomez and Nikole Killion. Finn is our CBS News political director, and Nikole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Favorites of mine, personally. Viewers should be well aware. Great to have you both. Nikole, you're still there at the venue where former President Trump spoke today. He spoke quite a lot about crime, among other things, specifically what he has long described as his love of police officers. Let's just listen to another sampling of that.
Next year, our new majorities in Congress should vote to strengthen qualified immunity and other protections for our great police officers. They have to become our heroes. They are mine, but some people, they don't feel that way. They're going to have to feel that way if we're going to have a great country and a safe country.
Nikole, what your reflections are from hearing the messaging in former president's speech today, considering crime, immigration, old chestnuts, so to speak, when he was campaigning for president. What did you make of his messaging today?
Well, look, this was about kind of laying out some of the messaging that we have heard from Republicans, but, really trying to galvanize the base ahead of the 22 midterms, as well as, of course, the 2024 election, should he decide to get in. And so he talked towards the end of his speech that he would likely lay out more policy ideas in the future. But, this particular speech was more centered and focused around the issue of crime. And so while we did hear the former president bring up a lot of familiar themes like the illegal immigration and, this issue of, really addressing a lot of crime that occurs in a number of cities, he once again, kind of brought back this theme of a law and order, which is something he talked about quite extensively, especially not only during his initial campaign in 2016, but more specifically in 2020. So we heard him really talk about trying to restore a lot of the policies that he enacted when he was in office. For instance, on the issue of immigration, he talked about, for instance, trying to restore a lot of his policies from his administration, like the Remain in Mexico policy. He talked about, for instance, had he won the election, that, they were trying to expand the wall, and that if he had stayed in office, that was something potentially that would have happened. And so he additionally talked about, again, just dealing with the issue of crime. He talked about a number of anecdotes in different cities across the country and accused Democrats of not doing enough on the issue of crime. Talked about, boosting funding for police, making sure there are more officers on the street, restoring controversial policies like stop and frisk, taking down tent cities in, various cities in terms of the issue of homelessness, and trying to erect areas on the fringes and outside of cities to deal with the issue of homelessness. So, there were a number of ideas that he put forth, a number of ideas that we have heard before. Again, mostly trying to talk about, in his view, that he feels the country is in decline, not only in terms of crime, but also in terms of the economy, foreign policy. And he did suggest that, it is important in his view to try to bring a lot of those policies back. And while he didn't go so far as saying he would get back in for 2024, he did talk about the significance of whether, again, it's in these 2022 midterms or in 2024, making sure those Republican policies are restored.
Yeah, and it's a great point you make, Nikole, at how a lot of this messaging is what worked for the former president in his previous campaign. And while he's not announced officially, we're certainly looking at this to see what new messaging might emerge. Finn, I know that the president barely mentioned the January 6th committee hearings. That's the new development that puts him squarely at the center of a congressional probe about how he behaved at the end of the last election. Georgia has its own investigation into this. What jumped out at you as far as what he did and did not focus on?
Well, as you mentioned, Errol, he basically stayed on message, which is something you don't typically see from a Trump speech. Frankly, he sort of meanders and goes off into different topics and whatever sort of fits his mood at the time. But today was, like, as Nikole said, primarily on message. It was on crime. It was on law and order, something that was policy driven. However, he did speak on the January 6th committee hearings. He did call them the unselect committee. He called the members of the committee thugs. And he said, they want to damage me so I cannot go back to work for you, alluding to 2020 perhaps. And I don't think that is going to happen, he said. So, I mean, even if he didn't mention it that much, he did mention it, and I believe it was significant.
And that's what I wonder for moderates, right? We've had Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell acknowledge that suburban moderates are really key to a lot of these Republican efforts for the midterm elections. And those moderate women who he mentioned,
sure,
while they may like the message, old school message to be tough on crime, they've certainly been among the tens of millions of Americans watching the January 6th hearings. I just want to kind of now contrast what the former president said with what the former vice president said. A different speech, using his remarks this morning to talk about his own vision for the future. Let's listen to some of that and see how it compares to what President Trump was saying.
Conservatism is bigger than any one moment, any one election, or any one person. It's always been about ideas. And YAF has been there every step of the way for half a century, inspiring Americans who cherish those ideals of freedom. And I know you'll continue to do just that. And I'm proud to say, under the Trump-Pence administration, it was those ideas that drove our policies every single day.
For Nikole, what did you make of what the former vice president had to say, and what, in your view, could indicate that he may be a potential presidential candidate in 2024?
Well, look, we have seen the former vice president, much like the president, former president, I should say, travel the country and talk to a number of different audiences. I mean, today it was talking to young conservatives. I mean, just last week he was here in Washington meeting with a conservative group of House Republicans. So, make no mistakes, Mike Pence has been making the rounds. And, while he also hasn't really talked extensively about January 6th, as you heard him earlier in his speech say, it is about looking to the future. And much of his messaging has been about, how do we grapple and deal with some of the issues facing the American people right now? And, he referenced earlier in his speech today, that many Americans are hurting. And so, whether it's the issue of the economy, whether it is other issues that are important to the base, we have certainly seen the former vice president try to go out and make the case and really kind of toe that line, while he was kind of complimentary of the policies of the Trump-Pence administration. At the same time, he does have to kind of walk this fine line, even though there are differences, certainly between him and the former president, especially as we have learned a lot of new information through the course of, for instance, of this January 6th, the committee hearings and the like. But that, again, is something where we haven't really seen Mike Pence, just very limited at times, kind of addressing that issue, addressing the fact that he did his duty that day, but also still towing the line of the successes, in his view, of the past administration, of his administration, and that of the former presidents, because at the same time, if he does eventually make a run or put his name in the hat, he does have to hold on to some components of that base, right? So that has really been a lot of his messaging throughout as he has traveled throughout the country.
It will be really interesting to watch. At some point, these, this former president and vice president may diverge on their messaging. It hasn't happened just yet. Finn Gomez and Nikole Killion, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Errol.